When Europe finished drawing maps and educating new elites, it was left with only one task: to preserve the world it had just created. An empire could no longer rely only on borders and schools. It needed something subtler, a network of economic ties, habits, tastes, and beliefs. It needed a world that would want to be its copy. And so a new phase of colonialism was born: economic, aesthetic, technological, and mental. The 20th century was only a bridge in that story. Wars destroyed the old empires, but not their methods. Instead of fleets and armies came corporations, banks, universities, trade missions, and international organizations. Borders stopped mattering. Flows began to matter, of resources, goods, people, capital, and information. Colonialism turned into a system of global interdependence, in which domination no longer looked like occupation, but like cooperation. Europe was still at the center, but no longer as a ruler, rather as a manufacturer of lifestyles. London and Paris sold dreams of freedom, class, culture, and luxury. Germany sold order and technology. Italy, fashion and design. Every nation had its own version of civilizational export. This was no longer military power. It was the power of aesthetics. The world was supposed to look like Europe, smell like Europe, behave like Europe. The Middle East, which 100 years earlier had learned European languages and institutions, was now learning European taste. Colonial schools had raised generations of engineers and officials ready to manage a new order, the order of goods. French wine, British tea, German machines, and Italian cars became the new symbols of progress. Europe no longer had to force anything. It was enough that it remained the reference point. But history never stops halfway. Every civilization that builds a model too perfect sooner or later becomes its prisoner. Europe, used to being the teacher, stopped noticing that others were still listening, but no longer in order to learn. Instead, to understand how to take the baton. In the East, a new power was rising, quiet, patient, pragmatic. It had no colonies, but it had factories, credit lines, and 1 billion people. It needed no civilizing mission. Export was enough. Just as 100 years earlier Europe had built modernity in the Middle East, so now China is building a global order in the shadow of the West. Back then, the tools were language and culture. Today they are technology and logistics. Then, the symbol was the school and the theater. Today it is the port and the smartphone. Then, empires dreamed of coloring the world's map in their own shades. Today, Beijing dreams of a world that naturally becomes part of its supply chain. This is the moment when a new era begins, a peaceful conquest of the second degree, in which history does not repeat itself literally, but it rhymes. In this part of the story, there will be no battles, generals, or borders. There will be ports, contracts, campuses, and advertising campaigns. Instead of a colonial uniform, a suit. Instead of medals, logos. Instead of a flag, a brand. This is a world in which empire smells of luxury, cooperation, and the promise of stability, and yet remains an empire, only a more polite one. Because history, as every century shows, cannot stand a vacuum. When one empire falls silent, another begins to speak its language, only more softly, more intelligently, and more effectively. Trade has always been the purest form of domination because it requires no violence and yet gives more power than an army. In the colonial era, it was enough for one country to control ports, another, sea lanes, and a third, the currency. The world was not really divided into rich and poor, but into those who set prices and those who had to accept them. Trade became the invisible language of empires. When in the 19th century the British built their maritime empire, they claimed they were exporting free trade. In reality, they were exporting dependence. Their fleets traveled between India, the Middle East, and Africa, bringing back spices, cotton, tobacco, and tea, and shipping out ideas of order, bookkeeping, and control. Every cup of tea in London was a symbol of a global chain of dependency, from plantations in Assam, through the Suez Canal, to shops in Covent Garden. Every shipment of goods carried more than raw material. It carried power over the direction in which wealth flowed. The Middle East held a special place in this game. It lay at the center of the world, where 3 continents and 4 seas intersected. For Europe, it was both a source and a crossroads of resources, ideas, spices, beliefs, and strategies. Here, trade smelled not only of cinnamon and cardamom, but also of geopolitics. For the British, the Suez Canal was an artery of empire. For the French, a gateway to Indochina. For the Germans, the point through which a railway from Berlin to Basra was supposed to run. A project so bold that it frightened London more than any army. But the real revolution began only when oil started flowing out of the desert. At the start of the 20th century, few understood its significance. In 1901, oil was still a curiosity, a fuel for lamps and experimental engines. 20 years later, it was the foundation of civilization. In a single generation, trade that had smelled of tea and tobacco began to smell of gasoline. The empire of steam gave way to the empire of oil. The British were the first to grasp that control over fuel meant control over the world. In 1908, deposits were discovered in Masjid Soleiman in Iran, leading to the creation of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the ancestor of today's BP. Soon, oil became the new gold and the Middle East, the resource bank of the world. In 1914, just before the war, Britain decided that the Royal Navy would switch from coal to oil. From that moment, every barrel from the Persian Gulf was no longer just a commodity. It was an element of British national security. Trade stopped being a transaction and became a geopolitical system. Europe was no longer simply buying goods, it was buying the future. In return, it offered infrastructure, ports, roads, railways, power plants. In theory, these were civilizational investments. In practice, logistical chains of dependency. Every new railway line was an artery of export, every factory, a point of control over the local economy. The Middle East became a map of interests, where trade routes drew lines of influence. In this system, trade was more than exchange. It was a language of polite domination. The French in Syria and Lebanon built refineries, the British in Iraq, fuel terminals, the Americans in Saudi Arabia, concessions for Aramco. Everyone spoke of development, but the real goal was access and control over flows. That is why empires invested not in people, but in pipelines. When decolonization swept the world after World War II, it seemed that the history of dependency was ending. But trade does not know freedom. It knows only balance sheets. In the 1950s, oil became a tool of revenge, a new kind of economic weapon. OPEC states started dictating terms, and the West discovered that any system built on someone else's resource is a hostage system. In 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, the Western world learned the true price of independence. When Arab states cut off oil exports, prices quadrupled. Panic spread through factories, offices, and capitals. That was the moment when trade stopped being a romantic vision of exchange and openly became a strategic weapon. From then on, oil and money defined who was civilized and who was desperately modern. Europe realized that its former pupils had become its energy suppliers, and that every economic equation had a political reverse. But history loves symmetry. 100 years after the British controlled the Middle East through ports and concessions, a new empire, China, began doing the same thing, only more gracefully. It does not send in the navy, but financing. It does not seize oil fields, it builds roads and terminals. Its strategy is trade as infrastructure, credit in exchange for loyalty, a port in exchange for partnership. Across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, entire economic networks are emerging where the real commodity is no longer oil, but dependence. For Beijing, trade is what religion was for 19th century Europe, a tool of expansion that doesn't provoke resistance. Every port they build becomes a point of influence. Every factory, a piece of the global supply chain, every loan, a quiet obligation. This is an economy with a human face that operates without violence, but with the same effectiveness. In places where British ships once anchored, Chinese container vessels dock today. Where English merchants built tea warehouses, Chinese contractors now build logistics centers and power plants. Tea and oil, two symbols of two eras. Tea smelled of elegance, oil of power. Both were currencies of influence. And both share the same logic. Whoever controls the flow, controls the world. Trade has always been far more than economics. It is a way to give the world rhythm, direction, and scent. In the age of empires, it smelled of lavender and tobacco. In the age of globalization, it smells of plastic and oil. In the New World Order, the smell of trade has not changed. Only the source of the aroma has. Where tea once flowed from India, oil now flows from Arabia, and in the future, the main current will be the flow of data and energy from China. Because empires do not truly fall, they change form. When Europe taught the world to buy its goods, it realized that the greatest product was not tea, cars, or steel, but a way of life. A style. A way of behaving. The smile that greeted a guest in a hotel in Cairo had to be the same as the one in London. The tie of a young civil servant in Beirut had to be knotted the same way as in Paris. Even the way a woman in Damascus held a coffee cup became part of a broader cultural system. A system that smelled of elegance but served order. In the colonial era, the West created its ideal of the modern person. The man was supposed to be educated, punctual, dressed in a suit and shoes from London. The woman, discreet, cultured, smiling, with a book or embroidery in her hands. The image of modernity was wrapped in form long before it was filled with content. For the Middle East and Asia, this was a symbol of progress, not only technical, but also social. The European style became both a code and a passport. Colonial elites embraced it with enthusiasm. In cities such as Alexandria, Cairo, Beirut, and Istanbul, gentlemen's clubs, Parisian-style cafes, bookshops, and cinemas appeared. On promenades, men strolled in top hats and jackets, women in dresses inspired by Western fashion. This was not a simple imitation. It was a cultural transfusion. The West was exporting not just clothes, but emotions, behavioral patterns, an image of what a free person should look like. Male elegance became a tool of control. The suit was the empire's uniform, a badge of belonging to the world of the modern. Even rebels and nationalists fighting for independence wore it like armor. Look at photographs from the 1930s and 1940s. Every leader of an anti-colonial movement from India to Egypt, from Palestine to Algeria, is in a suit and tie. It was the language that allowed them to speak to the West in its own code, even while demanding freedom. For women, the West prepared a different set of symbols. Education, fashion, cosmetics, manners, everything tasted of emancipation. But behind that emancipation was carefully disguised control. A woman was meant to be modern, but within boundaries set by the male world of elegance. It was modernity with a mirror, an offer of freedom in exchange for adopting the empire's aesthetics. In Beirut or Cairo, women started going unveiled, wearing hats, learning languages, and playing the piano. Newspapers wrote of the new woman of the East, but the articles were signed by men. Europe was exporting more than culture. It was exporting a narrative. In its version, emancipation was proof of a successful civilizing mission. A woman who chose European fashion proved that the West had triumphed not through force, but through aesthetics. Modernity acquired the scent of perfume, the rustle of silk, and the click of heels. In this world, revolution began in the wardrobe, not on the barricades. The Western lifestyle was also perfectly scalable. It did not require coercion, only that it be attractive. Unlike religion or ideology, it did not impose itself. It seduced. Advertising, photography, cinema, radio, all became new ambassadors of empire. Every Hollywood movie, every poster from Paris, was a lesson in how to live, love, and look. The colonial world learned to dream someone else's dream. In the 1950s and 1960s, when formal empires collapsed, culture replaced politics. The United States and Western Europe took over from the old colonial powers, offering entertainment instead of administration. Jazz, Coca-Cola, jeans and cars were the new language of influence. What could no longer be controlled by armies could still be controlled by aspirations. Teenagers in Cairo and Tehran danced rock and roll. Students in Beirut copied hairstyles from Paris and listened to Edith Piaf. The West won because its lifestyle was easier to fall in love with than to reject. But history knows no monopoly. Over time, the West ceased to be the only producer of dreams. Today, the same tools, fashion, film, advertising, technology, have become weapons in the hands of the East. Chinese brands are teaching the world a new aesthetics of success. Every smartphone, watch, car, or jacket is a manifesto of a different order. It no longer says, be like the West. It says, be efficient, modern, practical. Instead of elegance, functionality. Instead of distance, a sense of belonging to a technological community. In this sense, the contemporary world is once again repeating a script from a century ago. Lifestyle remains an instrument of power. Just as the man in a suit was once proof of progress, today his equivalent is the app user, the phone owner, the platform consumer. In both cases, the goal is the same: to plug the individual into the system, to make them feel part of modernity, even if they do not control its rules. Modernity always smells good. Once it was lavender and leather. Today, it is silicone and plastic. Once it wore a wool suit and a floor-length dress. Today, it wears a touchscreen and a logo on a t-shirt. But its function has not changed: to create a shared ritual. To ensure that people around the world wake up, look in the mirror, and think they want to look the same. That is the most perfect export of all, the export of a lifestyle. You can reject a foreign government, you can expel a colonizer from your country, but it is far harder to expel him from your dreams. In colonial times, missionaries arrived with a cross and a dictionary, teaching local populations language, religion, and discipline. In the 21st century, they have been replaced by engineers and consultants. Instead of prayer, they bring a PowerPoint presentation. Instead of a cassock, a project badge. Instead of the Bible, infrastructure plans. But the meaning of their mission is the same: to bring development in exchange for gratitude. Modernity required new apostles. After World War II, the West realized that to maintain influence, it was not enough to send diplomats. It needed specialists, experts on roads, railways, energy, communications. Their job was not to preach ideas, but to implement technologies. Once the missionary explained how to save the soul, now the consultant explains how to optimize the system. And just as missionaries did not come to listen but to teach, today's engineers rarely arrive to understand local contexts. They come to improve them. The Middle East and Africa became testing grounds for these new missions. In the 1950s and 1960s, Americans, Britons, and French sent teams to Arab countries to help build dams, power plants, and roads. In Cairo, Beirut, Baghdad, and Riyadh, modern administrative districts designed by Western architects sprang up. Each project carried the same symbolism: Western hands supposedly bringing civilization. But behind that help lay a contract. Every bridge, every dam, every factory tied the country to the creditor, to their equipment, technical language, and standards. Over time, these relations hardened into a system. Technical assistance turned into a global mechanism of technological dependence. Young engineers from Cairo, Tehran, or Damascus studied in Paris, London, and Washington, then returned home with skills, but also with a mindset that said, progress has a Western standard. Modernization became a form of loyalty. Even where the West no longer dominated militarily, its technocratic spirit lingered. This is when a phenomenon we now call technological colonialism emerged. Every power plant, every transmission line, every dam needed servicing, spare parts, expertise. The system was designed so it could not function without outside support. Formerly independent states became clients in a world that still belonged to their former teachers. In the 21st century, China took over this role. It understood what Europe had discovered a century earlier: infrastructure is power. But Beijing did it without ideology. Instead of talking about democracy or freedom, it talks about growth and efficiency. Where Europeans saw civilizing missions, Chinese planners see engineering projects. Where once there were schools and churches, now ports, highways, and 5G networks rise. Where statues of kings once stood, data centers stand. The new missionaries no longer teach prayer, they teach data management. Instead of religious obedience, they create economic dependence. Across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, thousands of Chinese consultants, engineers, and technicians work on the ground. They run power plants in Ethiopia, railways in Kenya, ports in Oman and Pakistan. Wherever the West spoke of reforms, China speaks of partnership. There is no moral vocabulary in its language, only cost-benefit analysis. This is what distinguishes the new model from the old. Europeans arrived with a mission of salvation. The Chinese come with an investment plan. Europe tried to teach the world how to think. China tries to teach it how to produce. Europe promised spiritual progress. China promises GDP growth. Both models share the same core, the need for control. But Chinese control is quiet, invisible, and mathematically planned. The new missionaries come in the name of technology. Their Bible is ISO standards, their prayer, the quarterly report, their sacrament, the signed contract. This is a world in which the engineer has replaced the priest and the consultant, the prophet. The contemporary faith is faith in development, data, graphs, productivity. Every project, every dam, every factory is a temple of progress. And just as priests once promised that salvation would come after death, consultants promise that growth will come after investment. Chinese engineers do not need weapons to gain influence. A laptop and a blueprint are enough. At airports in Addis Ababa, in terminals in Dubai, in ports in Djibouti and Alexandria, the same machines stand, running the same code. This is a new form of global evangelization, technocratic and emotionless. What was once called a civilizing mission is now called technology transfer. But the meaning has not changed. Teach to bind, help to lead. In the past, colonization was visible. It had flags, regiments, and administrators. It also had a language, foreign but recognizable. Today, colonization has no face and no uniform. It has an interface. It does not act through force but through habit. It does not impose, it offers. This is mental colonization 2.0. Quiet, global, polite. Its tool is no longer the school, the port, or the factory. It is the system in which people want to participate. In the age of data, no one has to teach anyone directly. It is enough to profile them. The algorithm knows your taste, your insomnia, your loneliness. It knows what you will like before you do. In this way, power that once controlled territory now controls attention. For decades, Europe and America taught the world what freedom should look like. Today, that freedom has been replaced by a new form of dependence. Dependence on connection. Every click is a decision, every search, an act of obedience. In the age of the internet, an empire doesn't need borders. Its territory is our time. Once conquered nations surrendered resources and land. Today, they surrender data and emotions. China's version of this story is even subtler. Beijing understood that you can build an empire that does not inspire fear, but trust. Instead of colonial administrations, platforms. Instead of garrisons, servers. Instead of schools, app ecosystems. Chinese mental colonization does not require knowledge of Mandarin. It is enough that hundreds of millions of people use devices and systems designed in Chinese labs. Whoever designs the tools, designs the user. Just as Europe once taught the world to drink tea at 5 o'clock, China is now teaching the world to think in notification cycles. Modernity is no longer an idea, it is software. People who once believed in progress now believe in updates. Every new version of an operating system is a small reform in the user's consciousness. This is colonialism that needs no propaganda. It is installed by default. Mental colonization 2.0 works through convenience. In the old days, an empire built roads and ports to prove it brought civilization. Today it builds platforms that let you buy, write, watch, and think faster. The more connected you are, the less independent you become. The more data you give away, the less you know about how it is used. Power over the body has been replaced by power over perception. That is why modern empires do not really need propaganda. Algorithmic personalization is enough. The system gives each person their own version of the world. It gives them content they like, people they approve of, opinions they already agree with. This is the most perfect form of colonization, one in which the conquered want to be conquered, because everything around them confirms that they are right. In the 2.0 era, the colonizer no longer imposes his culture. He copies it, tweaks it, and sells it back in an improved version. Social platforms work in the same way in Cairo, London, New York, Dubai, and Shanghai. People wear the same clothes, use the same slang, laugh at the same memes. This is not coincidence. It is a project of global emotional synchronization. The greatest irony of our time is that no one needs slaves anymore. Consumers are enough. In the 2.0 world, it is not the person who works for the empire, but their attention that works for the algorithm. Colonization has moved from physical space to mental space. It is no longer a fight over land, but over meaning. Over who gets to decide what truth, progress, and normal mean. Mental colonization 2.0 has no clear end because it has no clear beginning. It runs in a loop. Every click, every glance, every feeling strengthens the system that produced it. It is a self-feeding mechanism of influence, a global version of crowd psychology written in code. And precisely because of that, it is more effective than any empire that came before. Because never before in history has a human being been so free in words and so dependent in thought.